Welcome everyone to our 12th Lake Stewardship Workshop. I'm Jim Irwin, Chair of the Rocky Mountain Biosphere Reserve. I'll be your host at tonight's workshop, and Candy Irwin, my wife, and Daryl Kynes will be assisting. We're pleased to have Candy standing in for Dennis Hodgins to assist with our Q&A tonight. To begin, I would like to acknowledge that the Rocky Mountain Biosphere Reserve is in the Treaty 2 and 4 territories of the Anishinaabe people, and say that we respect and share their all-important teachings that water is a sacred gift and essential for all life. Since 1986, Rocky Mountain Biosphere Reserve has been bringing people together to share their knowledge for the well-being of our communities. In this respect, we're pleased to have Pascal Badiou share in this session of our lake stewardship workshops. Pascal is a research scientist with the Institute for Wetland and Waterfowl Research of Ducks Unlimited Canada, which conducts watershed research to help create and inform sound, sustainable wetland policies. Pascal joined the Institute in 2006. In general, his research focuses on the ecology of wetlands and large shallow lakes. In particular, he's interested in the role of wetland restoration and conservation can play in regulating water quality and quantity in the watersheds. He's also interested in the interactions of multi-stressors such as invasive species, nutrient loading, pesticides, and climate change effects on wetland ecosystems. Additionally, Pascal has been conducting research to determine the importance of wetland and carbon cycling and how these systems can be managed to mitigate against climate change. He's also interested in the use of constructed wetlands for the management of stormwater and treatment of sewage effluent to improve water quality at the watershed scale in urban areas. And impressively, he has authored or co-authored over 40 scientific publications. Pascal's presentation tonight is entitled "The Role of Wetlands in Regulating Water Quality in Prairie Watersheds." Pascal?
Well, good evening, everyone. Thanks for that introduction, Jim. And I'd like to thank the organizers for giving me the opportunity to present this evening. I think a lot of the work we have done over the last decade and a half is really relevant to Prairie Lake watershed groups. Obviously, our main habitat of interest are prairie wetlands throughout the prairie pothole region. And so hopefully by the time I'm done this presentation, you'll see how important those landscapes and ecosystems are for maintaining water quality and quantity throughout the Canadian prairies, as well as some other links to other aspects around climate change and greenhouse gas emissions. Since I joined Ducks Unlimited in 2006, most of the research that I have been involved with is focused on wetlands and the ecosystem services they provide. Folks might wonder why a research scientist with Ducks Unlimited Canada is working on ecosystem services and thinking about water quality and water quantity as opposed to simply waterfowl habitat. One of the reasons for this is because wetlands are what I like to call the Swiss Army of ecosystem services. And so historically, as an organization, we've focused mostly on wetland habitat in terms of providing landscapes for waterfowl to breed and reproduce. But we know that those systems offer a tremendous amount of other ecosystem services like water purification, flood and drought protection, carbon sequestration, and recreation. And in order to conserve and restore these systems to the level that they need to be at, it's going to take a broader segment of society to participate and to influence policy in that direction. And so we've, taken the critical step into broadening our perspective and scope of the work that we do to focus not just simply on waterfowl habitat, but also on the values that habitat provides for the rest of society. And so I like to share this figure because it does show just how valuable these aquatic ecosystems are And so outside of marine ecosystems, inland wetlands have some of the highest assessed ecosystem service values. And so this is from a study taken by de Groot et al. In 2012. And you can see that inland wetlands, in terms of ecosystem services, are valued at approximately $26,000 per hectare per year. Unfortunately, it's true what they say. You don't know what you got till it's gone. And so when we look at wetland loss historically, it is pretty staggering. And so estimates show that global land use change between 1997 and 2011 resulted in the loss of ecosystem services of between 4.3 and $20.2 trillion. And roughly 2.7 trillion is associated with impacts to wetlands. So depending on how you do that calculation, the range is anywhere from 13 to 63%. When we tie this back to our prairie landscape, which is a prairie pothole region outlined in red here, and clearly an area important for waterfowl, we also recognize that it covers almost the entire western portion of the Lake Winnipeg watershed, shaded in orange. But making the link between these small wetlands in water quantity and quality at that scale is difficult. And that's often because it's perceived that these small wetlands don't play a big role because of their diminutive stature on the landscape. But so considering the scale is very important. So if we focus on any one small wetland, it does appear rather significant. But when you zoom out and look at the landscape within the Canadian prairies and the prairie pothole region, it's easy to see how the network of these systems can play a role in terms of water quantity and quality regulation. And so this isn't an uncommon scene across the Canadian prairies. And in fact, depending on moisture conditions in any given year, you can have between 5 to 8 million of these small wetland basins. And they can comprise a fairly significant portion of the prairies in certain regions. And so again, when we're talking about prairie wetlands, we're referring mostly to these small non-floodplain wetlands that we consider to be geographically isolated. And what that means is that they lack bidirectional hydrologic connections with adjacent streams and rivers, and are often embedded in uplands and without well-defined surface inlets or outlets. Another important factor here is that these wetlands are often situated in working agricultural landscapes where land use change and drainage impact wetland function, and they're particularly vulnerable to climate change because unlike completely terrestrial systems, prairie potholes can't migrate with a changing climate. And so that's because these systems only occur where there's a depression in the landscape. So unlike grasslands or forests that can migrate as climate changes, a prairie pothole wetland is essentially locked in place. And as moisture conditions change, they will be directly impacted. Coming back to the Lake Winnipeg watershed, I wanted to share this map because, again, this will highlight why these small wetlands are in fact important. And so if we look again here at the area outlined in red, which is the Lake Winnipeg watershed, roughly 1 million square kilometers, you can see, again, the red shaded area in the western portion of that watershed. And that is what is known as non-effective contributing area. And so the assumption for that landscape that's shaded in red is that on an average year, it does not produce runoff. That means that the water that falls on it stays internal to that landscape. And so again, historically, that western portion has been deemed non-effective. And that's also the region where we find some, tremendous amount of wetland density with roughly 4.1 million wetlands covering about 3.4 million hectares. Now, again, those numbers can vary depending on the year and moisture conditions. And making this link to Lake Winnipeg, and in fact, all other prairie lakes is quite important. I probably do not have to remind this group that Lake Winnipeg in 2013 was voted the world's sickest lake. And when you see photos like this, it's easy to tell why. And the photo on the left here is actually one of the satellite images of an algal bloom in the north basin of Lake Winnipeg that spanned over 10,000 square kilometers. And again, I think the situation in Lake Winnipeg is really just symptomatic of the larger water quality and quantity issues that we see right across Canadian prairies. And so again, when we're thinking about the Lake Winnipeg watershed and the prairie pothole region and links to wetlands, it's important to understand what has happened with these systems historically. And so over the last 40 to 60 years, we've lost approximately 500,000 hectares of these small prairie wetlands. You can see the breakdown across the prairie provinces here, with roughly 133,000 hectares lost in southern Alberta, 250,000 hectares lost in southern Saskatchewan, and another 105,000 hectares lost here in southwestern Manitoba. And so these next two slides will just show you the type of change that we have seen in the landscape. Now, this is just one example from the Smith Creek watershed in Saskatchewan, but you can find this virtually in any prairie province. And so this is a photo, an aerial photo of a quarter section of land with some wetlands in 1948. And if I jump ahead, this is the same piece of land in 1995. And so you can clearly see the level of impact that we've had on the landscape in terms of converting those wetlands to productive agricultural land. That's really important because we're only really just starting to understand that, first of all, that wetlands have, really important roles to play in water quality and quantity. But in fact, it's these small wetlands that play a disproportionately large role. And so this is just a figure taken from some of Nandita Basood's work out of the University of Waterloo. Again, looking at surface area of wetlands and ponds and lakes in relation to their ability to process nutrients. And what you see across the board here is that these small wetlands do a far better job at processing nutrients. And, that wasn't very surprising to me because we've understood the same thing from a waterfowl perspective, that these smaller wetlands offer better habitat. And so if you were to compare, the same area of wetland, but divided between one large wetland, for example, on the left-hand side here with one 10-hectare wetland versus 10 1-hectare wetlands or 100.1 hectare wetlands, we see that those have pretty staggering differences in terms of their waterfowl production. And the reason for that is the smaller the wetland, the higher the perimeter to surface area ratio, which is where wetland vegetation occurs and where a lot of the biological processing occurs. And so similarly, when we're thinking about water quality and water quantity, one of the other things that we notice with these small wetlands is that they have a higher ratio of catchment area to wetland surface area. And so in fact, these small wetlands process a larger proportion of the landscape by unit surface area. And so this is just an example of that relationship taken from 3 different prairie watersheds that we've worked on historically. So I'm going to jump into a few different sections now dealing specifically with water quality and water quantity. And, one of the things that we have done is looked at wetlands embedded in grassland versus wetlands embedded in cropland, just to get a handle on how that impacts water quality in those systems. And so again, this is taken from some of our research in Broughton's Creek in southwestern Manitoba, which is just northwest of the city of Brandon, as well as the Smith Creek watershed in Saskatchewan, which is near Langenburg, Saskatchewan. And what you can see is that across these wetlands that we've studied, the mean phosphorus concentration in cropland wetlands is significantly higher than those found in grass and pasture systems. And then when we look at the median phosphorus concentrations, the difference is even more staggering, with a 40-fold higher concentration in those cropland wetlands relative to grass and pasture wetlands. This kind of highlights the importance of keeping these wetlands on the landscape to capture and process those nutrients. Now, we've also looked at water quality coming through drained wetlands on the landscape. And again, this was a study that we conducted in the Broughton's Creek watershed. And across the wetlands the drained wetlands that we were monitoring, the phosphorus concentration at the outlets of these systems were always very high, so 5 to 30 times guideline for hypereutrophic systems. Most of that phosphorus is present in dissolved form, and that's somewhat different than what's seen in other environments and other watersheds. And we're also finding that there's more bioavailable phosphorus coming through these drained wetlands and associated with their soils relative to intact wetlands. And so again, that's important for potentially fueling algal blooms downstream. Now, when we look at phosphorus export from these drained systems relative to other land uses, we can see that it's fairly significant. So the average phosphorus export from drained wetlands that we studied in Broughton's Creek averaged about 1.7 kilograms of phosphorus per hectare per year. If you compare that to the average phosphorus export for the Lake Winnipeg watershed, you can see that there's orders of magnitude of difference, with the Lake Winnipeg watershed having about a 0.07 kilogram of phosphorus per hectare per year export. Now, again, that's not a very fair comparison because a large portion of the Lake Winnipeg watershed lies within the boreal forest and has very low nutrient concentrations. But if we compare this, to example, to other land uses in terms of crop production, specifically here in Manitoba, again, we can see that the phosphorus export from drained wetlands is anywhere from 4 to 3 times higher than what we see from just straight cropland, whether that's conservation till or conventional tillage. Water quality and water quantity are intimately linked. And a lot of what wetlands do on the landscape in terms of assisting with water quality is related to their regulation of water quantity at the watershed scale. This is kind of driven home by this relationship from a study that looked, so this is fairly similar across prairie watersheds, but this is specifically from Saskatchewan, showing the strong relationship between runoff ratio and the amount of watershed that is considered to effectively contribute. When I'm talking about runoff ratio, that is essentially just the ease at which a watershed can convert precipitation into runoff. And so what we see here is that as the effective contributing area of a watershed increases, that runoff ratio increases. And that's important and directly linked to wetlands, because as we lose depressional storage, we see water yield, or essentially the effective drainage ratio, increase. And so this is, again, just highlighting a study from Minnesota that looked at water yield across 26 different watersheds and compared the impacts of drainage versus crop conversion versus climate, and clearly showed that most of the change and most of the additional water coming off the landscape was directly related to the loss of these small depressional areas, small prairie pothole wetlands across those watersheds. In a number of prairie watersheds, we have conducted detailed analyses based on detailed wetland inventories to look at change of historical wetland cover, usually looking at 2 time frames, anywhere from the 1950s, 1960s to more recent aerial photo, and then essentially updating the effective contributing areas for those watersheds. And so this first example is again from our work in Broughton's Creek in southwestern Manitoba. On the left-hand side, you can see the historical effective contributing area when wetlands were intact. And on the right-hand side, you see essentially the adjusted effective contributing area accounting for wetland loss in that watershed. And so again, here the results are pretty significant. So contributing area in that watershed has increased from just under 15,000 hectares to over 22,000 hectares. And so that's an increase of 53% since 1968. Even more staggering is the similar analysis that we did in the Smith Creek watershed of Saskatchewan. And so in that context, we've seen a 384% increase in contributing area. And so essentially, historically, almost no water came off of this landscape. In fact, it was unheard of for this system to flow at any point during the summer. it usually only produced any type of flow during the spring. And I'll come back to that in a few slides. And in fact, we've had to go back and redraw the watershed boundary for this landscape, and it's not shown here. But on the northwestern portion of this landscape, that watershed boundary has actually been breached with additional drainage from outside of the watershed that has expanded that watershed boundary. And so again, this is just showing the impact that losing these small wetlands and connecting these small wetlands can have in terms of watershed function. We have conducted some work and research with Dr. John Pomeroy from the University of Saskatchewan, who has spent his life essentially developing hydrologic models on the Canadian prairies and trying to modify them to account for these small prairie depressions. And historically, the saying, was that the prairies is where hydrologic models came to die because they're often developed in, either coastal systems or in systems that aren't flat. As soon as you have a flat landscape, hydrology becomes very complicated because water spreads out very quickly and flows very differently. But so we worked with Dr. Pomeroy and his group to look specifically at the Smith Creek Basin. And this slide just shows the huge degree of change that the hydrograph displays in that watershed. And so in this figure on the top panel, we're looking essentially at historical discharge from that watershed. So you can see that the maximum flow is occurring again early in the spring, and there is virtually no flow during the summer months and fall. We move to the second panel, which is looking at 1995 to 2010. You can see a fairly significant increase in spring discharge, but you can also see now that even during the summer months, there is some flow. And then if we look at the period from 2011 to 2014, again, you can see, the fairly noticeable increase in spring discharge, and now that peak is fairly broader. But for the first time ever, the maximum discharge from that watershed was recorded during the summer. And so it has completely flipped from how it behaved historically. And so John and his group have developed what's called the cold regions hydrologic model, and they applied it to this basin and generated some pretty significant conclusions based on their work, and showed that wetland drainage has a strong impact on stream flow and flood conditions, and that wetland drainage from 1958 to 2008 increased the 2011 flood peak in that watershed by 32%, and the 2011 yearly stream flow volume by 30%. They also concluded that continued wetland drainage would have a very strong impact on stream flow going forward. And so, for example, if you lost all the remaining wetlands in that watershed, the peak flow in 2011 would have been increased by 78% and the volume by a further 32%. This is in contrast to how hydrologists have historically viewed small wetlands. And so there's often been this notion that these small wetlands don't play a huge role, particularly in extreme events. But the science and modeling of late is now starting to confirm that, in fact, these systems do play a very significant role at the landscape scale. Along similar lines, this is, again, some work taken from Broughton's Creek, but again, looking essentially at the impacts here on the x-axis is essentially drainage intensity. And as drainage intensity increases across the subwatersheds, we can see that water yield is increasing proportionally. So this really demonstrates the need to account for wetland drainage and storage, as well as changes to contributing area. And again, this has been actually demonstrated in a few other studies. And so I highlighted the study from Minnesota earlier, but there's also research from North Dakota by Wang et al. That shows similar impacts to these small wetlands in terms of holding back stormwater. And that's really important because as water yield increases with the drainage of these systems, we also see this direct relation to phosphorus export. And so as we're draining wetlands, we're increasing water yield, and along with greater water yield, we have greater phosphorus export. And so as a result, wetland drainage is increasing phosphorus export at the watershed scale. And we've now seen this in a number of the prairie watersheds that we've studied, including in the Souris River Basin, the Assiniboine River Basin, as well as the Battle River Basin in Alberta. And so in the end, what's happening here is wetland drainage is converting areas that were acting historically as important phosphorus sinks to critical source areas for phosphorus export. And tying this all together, Genevieve Lee, who was with the University of Manitoba when this paper was published, but now she is, I believe, either with the University of Waterloo or University of Guelph, demonstrated some of the links between phytoplankton blooms in Lake Winnipeg and how connected the watershed is in a given year. And so in years where we're seeing greater connectivity in the Lake Winnipeg watershed, which we believe is being facilitated by loss of these small wetlands, that's usually when we see a larger prevalence of algal blooms in Lake Winnipeg. I've covered water quality, water quantity. Now I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about prairie wetlands and their role as natural climate solutions. I will try to run through these fairly quickly. But again, these prairie wetlands, have important features in terms of mitigating and adapting to climate change. So from a global perspective, wetlands store, approximately 30% of terrestrial carbon, but only occupy 5 to 8% of the landscape. Now, most of that carbon is locked up in peatlands, but there are other wetlands. So for example, the prairie wetlands that we study are marsh systems that are often very productive and can, have quite high rates of primary productivity with 250 to 3,000 grams of carbon per meter square per year. Now, the other important thing to realize is that prairie wetlands and wetlands in general are important. While they're important global carbon stores, they're also important sources of greenhouse gases, particularly methane. And that's often viewed as being negative, but it's important to note here that natural intact ecosystems that existed historically are not contributing new greenhouse gases, and they're not contributing to climate change. And so if a wetland has existed on the landscape for the last 2,000 years and has had roughly the same methane emission, it is not contributing to climate change. However, if you manage that wetland or impact that wetland in a way that alters the greenhouse gas emissions, then you have a potential to either ratchet up impacts on climate change or to dial them back. And so Ducks Unlimited was very interested in looking at carbon in prairie wetlands. We conducted a study right across the Canadian prairies, again, looking at a significant number of wetlands, spanning different restoration ages, and essentially showed that as wetland age or wetland restoration age increased, so did the carbon stock in those wetlands. And even after we factor in methane emissions, wetland restoration was predicted to sequester about 3.25 tons of carbon dioxide per hectare per year. But more importantly, was that through that research, we were able to identify that draining of these wetlands was likely releasing about 89 tons of carbon back to the atmosphere per hectare. The other important thing to note here is that there's important links between water quality in these systems and greenhouse gas emissions. And so can we manage wetlands in the agricultural landscape to help mitigate climate change? And so some of the important findings from our research is as sulfate concentrations in wetlands increase, we see this dramatic decrease in methane emissions. And so this suggests that, you could potentially target restoration and conservation projects to focus on wetlands that have higher sulfate concentrations to minimize methane emissions. Similarly, as phosphorus concentrations in wetlands increase, we see a corresponding increase in methane concentrations. And so if you think back to the earlier slides, I was showing about wetlands embedded in cropland versus wetlands embedded in grass and pasture systems. You can see that the water quality implications have these direct ties to greenhouse gas emissions. And so we would expect, based on this, that wetlands embedded directly in cropland are going to have higher methane emissions. And so that would kind of suggest that if you were able to restore buffer regions around prairie wetlands and agricultural landscapes, that you could potentially reduce greenhouse gas emissions from those systems. And again, this is still along the lines of linking water quality and methane emissions. This is in fact taken from constructed wetlands in the city of Winnipeg. And so you probably heard a little bit about those systems from Lisette in a previous presentation. And this is some research that we conducted on those systems to compare the constructed wetlands to conventional stormwater basins. And what we saw is that we had much lower chlorophyll A or algal populations developing in those constructed wetlands relative to the conventional stormwater basins. And that's really important because in those stormwater basins, what we were seeing is that if they were being treated, and even when they weren't being treated, is that they developed these massive blue-green algal blooms. And those blooms essentially resulted in large pulses of methane emissions. And that's because you have this readily available, easily decomposable organic matter in the form of these algal cells that are settling to the bottom of the ponds and consuming oxygen in the exact ideal conditions for methane production. And so I won't spend a lot of time on this slide because, again, this is just summarizing some of the findings from that work. But again, here, what we were clearly showing is that when we looked at the cumulative kind of weighted greenhouse gas emissions from those systems, from these urban constructed wetlands to the conventional and the conventional treated wetland basins, we saw that the constructed wetlands had much lower greenhouse gas emissions relative to the conventional basins. And again, that was directly tied to the water quality in those systems. And that's really important because when we think of how the landscape is currently being managed with respect to wetlands, we often see what's called wetland consolidation. And in fact, that has been promoted in certain regions where you drain a number of small wetlands to increase, access to land and productive land, and you drain them into one larger permanent basin. And in fact, that likely has fairly negative implications for climate change because you've drained small wetlands and you've exposed those carbon stocks. So you're losing that carbon back to the atmosphere. But in addition, when you consolidate into one larger permanent wetland basin, you actually degrade water quality in that system. And you often see very profuse blue-green algal blooms in these consolidated wetland basins. And therefore, you're going to see higher greenhouse gas emissions. And so you might, in fact, be making things worse on that front. And that's through this kind of established connection between climate change and eutrophication and some of the feedback cycles that exist between those processes. And then lastly, one of the things that we often don't consider, and again, because these are small systems, is I think we've all, been subject to lake effect weather. So if you're standing beside a lake on a hot summer day, it's usually cooler and more humid when you're standing beside that lake. Well, these small prairie wetlands, essentially provide the same service. It's just diffused over a much larger landscape. And when you lose those wetlands and convert it to other land uses, you actually change the energy budget of that system so that you have much more sensible heat remaining in play versus latent heat, which is typically produced through evapotranspiration. And so by doing that, you can actually significantly warm environments by losing water on the landscape. And this is come across in a number of modeling exercises that have been done where researchers have tried to incorporate wetlands and lakes into their models. And fairly unanimously, when this is done, when wetlands and lakes are accounted for in climate models, you generally see that wetlands increase regional evapotranspiration, they increase regional latent heat flux, they decrease sensible heat, so that's the heat that you would actually feel on your skin, and they essentially produce the summer cooling effect. So the models show that when you incorporate wetlands and lakes, that summer cooling of 2 to 3 degrees Celsius occurs. And they also have the potential to alter regional precipitation patterns, which again is, of course, vital to the Canadian prairies as you know, Canada's most important agricultural region. But those impacts are a little more difficult to assess. And so we conducted, this is a very crude analysis where we just looked at 60 prairie weather stations and buffered them and looked at the wetland density around those weather stations in a 50-kilometer radius. And this is just looking at daily average temperatures and daily maximum temperatures for the climate norms. And what we see is that as wetland cover increases, we see almost a degree difference in the daily average and the daily maximum temperature. And so again, showing these pretty significant impacts, and this is all corrected for latitude and longitude, knowing that there's obviously differences both in temperature and precipitation as we move from east to west and north to south. In the end, tying this all together, what we've generally seen across the Canadian prairies is this kind of conversion of the landscape from intact uplands with perennial cover and a mix of small wetlands and permanent wetlands that has slowly been eroded to, lose most of the perennial cover and lose most of the small wetlands, and then have a lot of smaller wetlands consolidated into larger, more permanent basins. And that has resulted, obviously, in habitat degradation, reduced storage capacity in terms of water, increased runoff, water quality degradation, increased nutrient export, and depletion of soil organic carbon stocks, and increased greenhouse gas emissions. And what Ducks Unlimited Canada is trying to achieve as an organization is to reverse that process in certain areas where it makes sense. And so going from these highly converted landscapes where wetlands have been lost to reestablish those wetland ecosystems and the mix of small wetlands and larger wetlands, and to restore upland habitat and perennial cover. And in doing that, you can, well, this is quite the reverse, unfortunately, but you can obviously restore waterfowl habitat, you can increase storage capacity on the landscape, you'll reduce runoff and the associated nutrient export, and you can increase carbon sequestration and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And so just to close off, I just wanted to highlight a number of programs that we use specifically here in Manitoba, but really right across the prairies, and in fact at a national level too, to encourage that type of change on the landscape to achieve those wetland habitat goals as well as water quantity and quality objectives. And so I'm not going to cover all 7 programs here, but I just wanted to highlight a few that we do deploy specifically here in Manitoba that helps achieve some of these goals. And so we have a forage program, again here that can help and compensate landowners to convert cropland to perennial forage. And this obviously has a benefit both in terms of reducing runoff, because perennial cover typically has higher infiltration rates. And because you have higher infiltration rates, most of the nutrients stay locked up on the landscape and do not leave and move downstream. We also have what we call our marginal areas program. So this is specifically in agricultural landscapes that are marginal and maybe not producing as well. Again, we have programs where you can target those landscapes and again, convert those to, either a grazing or a haying or another type of perennial forage system, which will again help increase the yield of that landscape, reduce some of the impacts of additional agricultural inputs. and obviously help with ecosystem services in terms, again, of reducing runoff and improving water quality. And then obviously, one of our largest programs, conservation easements and wetland restoration programs. And so again, this is where we work with landowners to directly either conserve and place conservation easements on wetlands and agricultural landscapes, or to go out and in fact restore some of these basins. And so these can again provide fairly significant incentives to landowners. And last year, on average, the payment through the conservation agreements and wetland restoration program was about $105,000. And then more recently, with the province of Manitoba's GROW program, we have a new program that focuses on shallow wetlands and class 1 and 2 wetlands, which are, usually, which are the ephemeral and temporary wetlands on the landscapes. And so this is a program aimed at incentivizing landowners to not drain these systems, and the trade-off is that in dry years you can still farm them, but as long as you're not draining them, when the water comes back, the moisture conditions are present, those wetlands will reestablish. And so this is just an example of the landscapes where we work in Manitoba. And so again, we target a lot of our programs to waterfowl regions and areas of high waterfowl productivity. And so those are kind of highlighted by the darkly green shaded areas here. But then, of course, we have other partners, for example, Manitoba Habitat Heritage Corporation and other organizations and ENGOs that will deliver similar type of program in non-waterfowl landscapes. So with that, I'm happy to open it up to questions. I realize that was probably a little bit like drinking from a fire hose and that I threw out a ton of information, but happy to entertain any questions that the group might have.
One question that's come through is, would reducing the amount of phosphorus applied to annual crops reduce the phosphorus yield to lakes in Lake Winnipeg?
Well, so that's a great question, and I think there's this perceived notion that agricultural producers are over applying phosphorus, and I don't know if that's necessarily the case, because anyone who's talked to landowners and agricultural producers knows that those inputs are, really expensive. So I don't think people are trying to be wasteful with agricultural inputs. The problem with phosphorus is it only takes a very small excess to produce changes in water quality. And so one of the stats there is, a change in concentration in the water body is of as little as 10 micrograms per liter. So that's a thousandth of a milligram, can produce significant changes in algal populations. And so again, there probably are hotspots where there might be more phosphorus coming off the landscape than in others. And in those regions, if you can target those, then yes, potentially trying to improve conditions to minimize phosphorus runoff would be helpful. But again, I don't necessarily think that over application is the biggest issue. I think it's mostly the transport. And so usually phosphorus issues are a combination of source issues and transport issues. And so even though the source in the Canadian prairies might be fairly small, the transport issues have become what I think is the main driver now.
Is it the transport of nutrients along the path the water takes that you're talking about?
Yeah, so anytime water leaves a landscape, it is going to take some of the nutrient with it. So for example, in the spring snowmelt period, we typically see water interacting with just, a fairly shallow segment of the soil column that's thawing, and you can leach significant amount of nutrients from that. And so if that water is staying put which often happens when you have perennial systems and wetland systems, you can keep that water and the nutrients on the landscape. But if you are converting perennial cover and connecting up these small systems, you essentially facilitate the transport of that water and therefore the associated nutrients downstream, usually into adjacent lakes, rivers, and streams.
Have any projects offered carbon credit payments?
That's another good question. And so whenever we're dealing with wetlands and carbon credits, it's pretty challenging. And so, we can show that wetland restoration sequesters carbon. We also know that avoided conversion prevents the loss of carbon. But accounting for methane is really tricky because it depends on the time scales you look at. And there is, in fact, now a number of different metrics being used to calculate the impact of methane emissions from those systems. So all that to say that there's no good carbon offsets in place at the moment, or protocols developed for carbon offsets dealing with freshwater ecosystems. There are some that exist for coastal salt marshes, largely developed in San Joaquin in California, and there are some definitely being developed in Eastern Canada. So you've probably heard those referred to as blue carbon. But this is a line of research that we're in fact actively engaged in, and we're just starting up a project this year where we're going to be deploying 2 Flux towers in prairie wetlands. And so these will be the first time deploying these types of systems on prairie freshwater temperate wetlands. So it's going to be here in Manitoba, again, close to Newdale. And for those of you who don't know what eddy covariance flux tower systems are, essentially this is just a really fancy gadget that can look at the ecosystem footprint in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. And so essentially all it is a sensor that can look at eddy currents in the air. So essentially the change in air moving up and down and the concentration of greenhouse gases. And then it calculates a footprint. So we'll be able to get an entire wetland outfitted with this system so that we can know exactly the net carbon balance in terms of carbon coming in through photosynthesis versus carbon potentially going out through methane emissions.
That sounds pretty neat. How would we be able to tell that one of these towers is out there? Would this be visible on the landscape, or is this quite a short tower?
These likely will be visible because you have to try and get about 1.5 meters above the vegetation. And so anyone who's walked through a prairie marsh knows that the cattail can get quite high. And so in fact, we're going to have to install scaffolding in some of the open water portions of these 2 wetlands that we're focusing on to get that equipment deployed at the right height. So it's going to involve using solar power systems and some fairly sensitive instruments in terms of measuring precipitation and wind speed and direction.
Another question that came in is, do you know the location at Newdale where these are going to be installed?
I probably have to be careful in terms of privacy issues, so I don't think I can actually give the specific locations, but they are both, I'd say they're both essentially just north of the Browns Creek watershed where we've worked in the Oak River watershed, which is immediately to the west of the Browns Creek watershed.
What kind of phosphorus should we be looking for when we are trying to figure out if nutrients are coming into our lake from any of the streams that are out there?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so that actually differs pretty significantly by region. And so when I was talking earlier about water quantity models, there's also issues with water quality models because most of them have been developed in the US Midwest, where you have a lot of erosional features on the landscape. And so often around the Great Lakes, lots of the phosphorus that was just coming off the landscape historically was in particulate form. Now, through the studies that Ducks Unlimited and numerous other researchers have done here in the Canadian prairies, you know, particulate phosphorus and phosphorus associated with sediments really isn't a huge issue. In fact, we see most of the phosphorus leaving the landscape in dissolved form. So if you're looking to quantify phosphorus at your site, you can probably actually use either total phosphorus or total dissolved phosphorus because they'll likely be quite similar because most of the phosphorus is in dissolved form.
Well, we've got a comment. Your presentation was excellent. Thank you, Pascal.
Oh, glad to hear it. Hopefully I didn't overwhelm the group tonight. I know there was a number of slides and a lot of information included there. One thing I'd like to point out is that if anyone on the webinar ever has any questions about any of the programs that we do offer, I'm certainly happy to put you in contact with our regional office in Brandon. So I really just skimmed over those quickly, and in fact I jumped a number of the programs that we do offer. And so for any landowners in that region of southwestern Manitoba, living around these prairie lakes who are interested in exploring those options, I'm more than happy to put you in contact with the right staff, to get you up to speed on the various programs that we do offer.
I have a question that's come through. It says private conservation organizations do not have the resources to affect enough of the landscape to make a real difference. Is DU advocating for large-scale conservation programs like the Conserve Nation Reserve program in the US?
That's another good question. I would say that our organization would probably be the first to admit that making a dent in this issue is really challenging. It is a daunting task. But I think that governments of all levels, whether that's municipal, provincial, federal, are all coming to the realization that, it is much better to work with Mother Nature than to try and work against her. And so, there are current federal programs now dealing specifically with nature-based solutions. And I would point to Manitoba as a great example. In terms of developing wetland policy and incentivizing wetland conservation in agricultural regions. And so, which I think puts us in a really good position when we're talking with our neighbors, in Saskatchewan and Ontario about what their policies could look like and potentially try to mimic the example that Manitoba has set. Are we all the way there? Probably not. There's always work to do on that front. And so, yes, it's a daunting task. I don't know if I'm necessarily advocating for a conservation reserve program, similar to what we've seen in the US, because that has had problems too. So one example I can give with that program is, the conservation reserve program was paying landowners to keep grasslands intact, essentially offering them a carbon payment. But as soon as commodity prices switched, because those were locked up under short-term easements, millions of acres got plowed. And so the carbon that was paid for by the taxpayer essentially was re-released back to the atmosphere fairly quickly. And so you have to be careful with some of those programs and how they're formatted. And especially when you're dealing with carbon, there are a lot of issues to consider in terms of additionality and leakage. And carbon offset systems are, have a lot of logistics behind them that are important to consider.
Oh, I've got another question for you. Can you comment about the cattail project with a Hutterite colony in the Riverton area?
Well, I am familiar with the cattail project with a Hutterite colony, but the one I'm thinking of is in Pelly's Lake. So I'm not familiar with the one in Riverton. I'm going to assume that the International Institute for Sustainable Development is involved with that. But I can tell you the experience that we had at Pelly's Lake, which was essentially looking at harvesting cattail, both to essentially pelletize it to kind of co-heat facility owned by a colony near Pelly's Lake, but then also to try and extract phosphorus from that vegetation, from that wetland system. And so those are the types of things, that I think it's important for us to start considering in terms of these cyclical and closed cycle economies, right? Where you can try to generate resources and solve environmental issues at the same time. And we did see that with harvesting those cattail, you could actually significantly increase carbon sequestration at those sites.
Why is Canada the only industrialized country without large-scale conservation programs? I am thinking of CRP in the US and the Common Agricultural Policy in Europe.
Yeah, well, so that's another good question. And I've thought about that as well. And some of it comes down to just differences jurisdictionally. So here in Canada, water and wetlands, those are largely dealt at a provincial level. Whereas in the US, wetlands are treated through the Clean Water Act, which is federal jurisdiction. So regardless of what state a wetland is in, the federal government in the US, historically has had jurisdiction over those systems in terms of their loss or conservation and restoration. And so those are some differences just between how Canada and the US have operated, which then, results in this kind of quilted patchwork of wetland policies in Canada. And so hopefully the various jurisdictions will learn from each other. And there is, a pretty large range in terms of wetland policies from Eastern Canada to Western Canada. But there definitely has been significant improvements. But again, I think it would come down to how you view the jurisdiction of those systems and whether you're dealing with it at the federal level versus a provincial level. Those were great questions, spanning a nice wide range of topics. So from policy to science, you guys are keeping me on my toes.
Well, thank you very much for a very informative presentation and answering the questions also well there, Pascal. We really appreciate you taking the effort to share this information with us. It's very important. And thank you, Candy and Daryl, for assisting with the Q&A. I'd like to say good evening, everyone, and thank you all for joining us.